Anyways, one thing I know, guys, I didn't go over yesterday, and something that we're asked about a lot is army composition. A lot of people are really confused on what to do, how to set up their armies, stuff like that. And even my army right now isn't really set up optimally. I've actually been setting up to split it. And that's why I have 2 cannons, 4 horse, because normally I won't have any more than 2 horse per stack unless I'm a cavalry focused nation. And that's because cavalry are nice, but they're super expensive. Anyways, so let's go ahead and look at that real quick. When I'm creating a stack, I'm almost always, no matter what point of the game it is, even at the late game stage, going to have 2 cavalry in it. And the reason why is for flanking. Cavalry provide defense from flanking, and they also provide offense for flanking. And flanking is part of your combat width. And your combat width is how many troops can be on the front line at a time. And you're going to see combat width over here. So when I'm in battle right now, I can have up to 25 troops on the front line trying to kill each other. Now, combat width can also affect how effective you are against your opponents. Let's say you're a tech ahead of them, and part of that tech is combat width. You know, part of the bonus that you get from it is adding to your combat width, like right here. That means you can have 2 more troops on the front line than your opponents can, which can be really, really nice. It can actually really help you, especially if, let's say, you have flanking and they don't. If I was facing an opponent who had all infantry for their frontline troops, then having my cavalry for that flanking is huge. It can cause a lot of extra damage. And vice versa. If I don't have cavalry to defend, then I can take quite a bit of extra damage from flanking. And that's why I always just have a rule of thumb of always having at least 2 cavalry per army. And the reason for 2 cavalry is you only need 1 for the flanking offense and defense. But let's say that one gets hurt. Let's say you lose all the troops for that one unit. Well, if that unit retreats from battle, you now no longer have any cavalry to actually fight, so you could start taking flanking damage or losing your flanking advantage. So I always have 2, that way in case one takes too many losses, that other one's still there to reinforce, still there to cover that flanking capability. So what I would do for a stack right now, if I really was trying to make a efficient stack, I'd be doing 1 cannon, 2 cavalry. The reason for 1 cannon is cannon isn't super effective in combat until Tech 16. Once you get Tech 16, actually, and cannons become more effective over time, but Tech 16 is where cannons, and I should say fire, becomes more valuable than shock. Right now, shock is far more valuable than fire, and because these are your 2 phases in battle. You have a shock phase and a fire phase. Shock is going to come first, followed by fire. And right now, our shock equals 3 total damage, whereas our fire is only 1.8. See from the totals here. So, and that's why shock is better, obviously. Is, well, 3 is bigger than 2, right? Or 1.8, I should say. Anyways, so right now, shock is king, but fire is going to slowly add up and slowly have more gains until it eventually replaces fire. Or, replaces shock, sorry. Because you can see here, we're only gaining 0.2 shock, but we're going to be gaining 0.5 fire. So it's going to slowly trickle up until Tech 16. At Tech 16, that's where it is pivotal to get as many cannons into your army as possible. And the reason why is because when you're in combat, and like I've covered before, you have 2 different rows. You have your front row, which is all your frontline troops, your cannon fodder, essentially, which is going to be infantry and cavalry. Your back row is where your artillery sits, and your artillery fires over your front row. So artillery, when it's during the artillery phase of fighting, takes no damage. The frontline troops are what take damage. So if you can have as much artillery as possible filling that back row, you can do a heck of a lot of damage to your opponent. The only time that that's not going to be the case is if you don't have a full front row, though. You have to have that fodder. You have to have the human shields protecting your artillery. If your artillery is the only one in combat, artillery does horrible in combat on the front line. So you absolutely do not want to have too much artillery in a stack, because as you start taking losses on the front line, if you have no reserve troops to fill it in, your artillery will start filling in those slots. So that's why I don't have tons of artillery right now. Right now I only have artillery specifically for sieging forts. Artillery gives you a bonus against forts when you're sieging, and so right now that makes artillery very, very useful, but only in small numbers. Anyways, like I was saying, so as you slowly build up, though, toward that Tech 16 to where fire becomes king and you want more artillery for firing from your back line, uh, you want to eventually start adding more artillery to your stacks. That also applies because your fort levels will eventually go up, so you'll need more artillery to have that bonus against them. Once you hit forts that are level 3, or actually they'll be what? Yeah, no, level 4, because they go up by 2 each. One artillery won't give you bonuses. It's not going to do it. So you're going to have to slowly build up to have more artillery or cannons in your stacks to be able to get that bonus for sieges. Once that happens, the rule of thumb I go for when it comes to actually building my stacks is I go either by about a 3-2 ratio or a 4-3 ratio. And what that ratio is frontline troops, meaning infantry and cavalry, combine versus your backline troops, which is your artillery, your cannons. And that ratio I do is because you're going to take losses in combat. And so you want to have enough troops to take those losses while still having as many artillery as possible in that combat. A lot of people have debated with me saying, well, but in multiplayer, you're always going to have your front row filled, so you won't need cavalry and stuff like that. I don't worry about the situations where I'm going to have 100,000 troops versus 100,000 troops. I'm worrying about one stack versus another stack. And since I don't worry about competitive multiplayer, I focus on just overall gameplay and single player for everyone. And so for that, I try to make my stacks as self-sufficient as possible when it comes to combat. And I try to get my, I guess you could say, stats as efficient as possible, or the idea that one of my army stacks is going to fight one of their army stacks. Anyways, so if I was going to do that right now for what I was talking about, my 3-2 or my 4-3 ratio, what I'd be doing is I generally like to have multiples of 5 for my army stacks. It's just a personal preference. You can have whatever multiple you want. It just makes it easy for a lot of the 3-2 or 4-3 ratio I like to go by. And also an explanation for that ratio. The reason I go for ratios like that for 4-3 or 3-2 is it's pretty efficient. It allows you to take frontline losses, like I said, while still having lots of backline troops. If you try to go half and half, let's say you're trying to go for, let's just say, a 40 stack, and you try to have 18 infantry and 2 cavalry, and then 20 artillery in the back, the moment your front line takes losses, one of those cannons is going to get pulled to the front, and it's going to automatically be in frontline combat, which artillery are horrible with. So that's why you don't want to do equal equal, I guess you could say, splits in your army, is because you don't want your cannons ever being pulled to your front line. So if you do a 3-2 or a 4-3 ratio, the likelihood of your cannons getting pulled to the front line is pretty low unless combat lasts a long time, which means both sides have huge amounts of morale. Combat's usually not going to last long enough for your artillery to take damage, as long as you have about that ratio. Your frontline troops will just take the damage for you. And it'll allow you, like I said, it'll allow your backline troops to be as efficient as possible without taking the extra damage themselves. So that's kind of my basic overview of the way I do my splits for my armies, and the reasons behind it. Like I said, it's just my personal preference, and it's also just my experience in the game that if you do a 3-2 or a 4-3 ratio of frontline troops to artillery, it's going to really help you in combat. And it's the thing that's caused the biggest difference for my combat, as I had to learn how to design my stacks over time. I guess for quick math, if people are going to go with it, I usually go up to 30 stacks. That's about the max that I build, just for efficiency. That way I'm not taking attrition damage on really low supply provinces like in the steppes or mountains or stuff like that. But anyways, if I was going to build a 30 stack with, let's say, fire being king at Tech 16, I'd build the stack being probably, let's see, look at it. Actually, that's the easier way. So we'll create a template. Let's say if we were going to have 8 cannons. So, okay. So right here would be a 3-2 ratio. So we'd have 12 frontline troops versus 8 backline troops. So, anyways, so that's a 3-2 ratio right there. And that's 3-2. So you have 3 frontline troops for every 2 backline troops. And that'd be, so you see that's for, if I was going to build a 20 stack right there. If I was going to do a 30 stack, go up to 10. I just keep adding infantry for my front line. Like I said, I don't go beyond really 2 cavalry unless I'm doing a cavalry-centric nation. So we're going to be looking at 24 right there. So we're going to be looking at 28. So that right there would be a 30 stack for me. Because that way I'm having 18 frontline troops versus 12 backline troops. That's a 3-to-2 ratio again. And like I said, you can also do a 4-3 if you want. Or something like that. If you want, you can do something like a 4-3, but I usually prefer something like a 3-2. And the reason why is because if you do a 4-3 ratio, you have a lot more backline troops, but you also have a lot less cannon fodder. And if your opponent has something like artillery damage, or you're facing somebody like Poland or Prussia that are going to do just massive amounts of damage to you or take a lot less damage, you want to have that extra cannon fodder to soak it up so that your artillery can be as efficient as possible. But anyways, that'd be a rough ratio for a 30 stack for me, for most nations that I play. Like I said, this only changes if you're playing a cavalry-centric nation. And cavalry-centric being, Poland, or you could even say Ottomans or Mughals kind of have a bit, they have a bit of cavalry bonuses, or a steppe horde. Those are nations that you'd want to have more cavalry. If you're going to play a nation, Poland's a pretty popular nation to play, and for Poland, my composition actually is completely different. If I'm making a 30 stack for Poland, that's a 30 stack for Poland for me. And the reason why is because Poland's cavalry is god. They have the highest cavalry bonuses that you can get out of these nations. Their cavalry is amazing. So if you stack it correctly, I believe it's something like a 90% bonus to their cavalry, for their combat bonus. It's been a little while since I did a Poland game. Those are one of my favorite nations. Be right back. I'm going to let my dogs out real quick.